It was one of those mornings when Oxford looked washed clean of memory, the kind of rain that doesn't fall, but drifts, as though reluctant to touch the ground. I remember sitting by the window of a small cafe on Holywell Street, a second cup of lukewarm coffee beside the folded Times, staring at the crossword clue that refused to yield. 7 letters. State of remorse. I'd tried regret, sorrow, atoning, none fit. The word eluded me the way truth so often does, visible, but never quite within reach. The door creaked, letting in a gust that carried the smell of wet coats and pavement. Lewis arrived, looking faintly apologetic, as though he had interrupted a private service. He always did that and was aware of crossing thresholds too carefully. He said something about the weather. I nodded and said nothing. I'd been thinking of the word penitent, though it wasn't in the grid. He slid a manila folder onto the table, the edges already soft from the rain. "Found this in the church office," he said. "A note in a Vestry book from years ago. Thought you might want to see it." He spoke as if unsure why he was bringing it to me, and in truth I wasn't sure either. Oxford has no shortage of ghosts in its records, anonymous letters, whispered confessions, unsigned apologies, but something in his tone made me unfold the papers. The ink had faded to the brown of old leaves. Only one line stood out clearly. "Forgive me, Father. I saw him fall, but I let him go." There was no date, no signature, just that slender sentence, balanced between sin and silence. Lewis said the note had been tucked between the pages of the Vestry book at St. Frideswide's, newly discovered during cataloguing for the diocesan archive. He was careful not to sound superstitious, though his voice lowered slightly when he mentioned it had been written around 1974, the year Canon Draycott drowned near Folly Bridge. I looked out the window again. The rain had thickened, and the spires across the street blurred like underwater shapes. I asked if anyone had connected the note to Draycott's death. Lewis said not yet. He mentioned the coroner's verdict, accidental drowning, a stumble on the towpath after evensong. I vaguely recalled a newspaper clipping, a photograph of a clerical collar against black water, a brief headline, "Respected, Oxford Canon dies in fall." Nothing about forgiveness or guilt or someone watching him fall. The waitress came to clear the cups, her bracelets faintly jingling. I noticed the crossword on the folded paper, a small dark square where the answer still refused to appear. State of remorse. She glanced at it, frowned, and moved on. Sometimes strangers hover near solutions without knowing they're there. Lewis waited for me to speak. I didn't. Instead, I asked for the Vestry book itself. He said the archivist at the Bodleian had it now, under accession review. I'd have to make a request. He added with a faint smile that it wasn't exactly a homicide file. I told him all deaths are homicide files if you look long enough. He didn't laugh. Outside, a church bell rang somewhere toward the river. Not a clean peal, but a hesitant one, as though the clapper had lost its nerve halfway through. I've always thought bells know more about confession than priests do. Their voices tremble with the weight of unspoken names. When we stepped out, the air had turned colder. The street lamps flickered faintly in the noon gloom. Lewis said he'd drive, but I preferred to walk. There are distances best measured by footsteps, not engines. As we passed the Sheldonian, I thought of that line. I saw him fall, but I let him go. Whoever wrote it hadn't wanted discovery. Notes like that are meant to haunt, not to explain. I found myself wondering why anyone would hide a confession in a Vestry book. Perhaps because a book that records marriages and funerals is a fitting tomb for private sin. Or perhaps the writer had trusted God to read it before men did. Either way, the ink had survived 4 decades of dust, which seemed reason enough to listen. At the corner of Broad Street, a bus hissed past, throwing up spray that glimmered under the rainlight. I thought of the drowned vicar, of Folly Bridge, of the impossible peace that sometimes follows deliberate cruelty. And then, without realizing, I'd found the word. Penitent, 7 letters. It fit perfectly, though the clue no longer mattered. I remember the way the canal looked that morning, a ribbon of grey water lying perfectly still, as if the city itself had stopped breathing. The towpath was slick with moss, and the willows leaned low enough to brush their reflection. It was Lewis who walked ahead, his coat collar turned up, trying to find the path that led to the side door of St. Fritzwide's. I followed more slowly, my mind turning over the single sentence from that note. Forgive me, Father. I saw him fall, but I let him go. It lingered in my head like the last bar of a hymn sung off-key. The church appeared almost suddenly, half hidden behind a row of crumbling cottages. There was nothing grand about it. A squat Gothic body, its stone darkened by years of rain and neglect, its windows clouded by condensation from within. The bell tower listed slightly, as though exhausted by devotion. Inside, the air held the scent of damp wood, candle wax, and disuse. I could hear the faint dripping of water somewhere beyond the chancel, and the echo of our footsteps came back like the memory of another investigation long since closed. Reverend Harcourt greeted us as a thin man with uncertain hands and a habit of looking at the floor when he spoke. He said he had taken over the parish 3 years ago after what he called a period of administrative silence. He used that phrase carefully, as though he'd borrowed it from a diocesan report. I told him we were interested in a note found in the Vestry book, and he led us into a side room filled with ledgers stacked like tombstones on a table. He spoke softly about the discovery of how the note had been found by an archivist preparing the records for transfer, slipped between the pages of 1974. He said he hadn't read it himself, only been told of its existence. His voice trembled slightly on that point, the way a man does when he's lying by omission rather than commission. The vestry itself was smaller than I'd imagined, lit by a single high window that let in a slant of pewter light. On one wall hung a framed photograph of a choir, frozen in cheerful poses, their faces oddly luminous against the dull plaster. I stepped closer. The label beneath read, St. Fritzwide's Choir Trip to Wells Cathedral, Easter, 1974. I could make out 4 names underlined faintly in ink. Canon Draycott, Lionel Spence Verger, Simon Clay, Margaret Davenant. Lewis, ever dutiful, took notes as Harcourt muttered dates and inventories. I watched the man's hands instead. They shook slightly when he mentioned Canon Draycott. He described him as a figure of some distinction scholarly, rather private. Drowned, he added, one evening on the canal towpath after choir practice. The inquest called it an accident. Harcourt paused, waiting perhaps for me to contradict him. I didn't. Something in the air had shifted. I noticed the faint scent of mildew mingled with incense the way neglect tries to imitate sanctity. I asked to see the exact place where the vestry books were kept. Harcourt hesitated, then produced a ring of keys. The cupboard was locked, though its hinges were corroded. Inside, among ledgers bound in green and red cloth, lay one marked 1970-1975. The edges were frayed as if it had been handled more than the others. I turned the pages carefully. The handwriting was neat, clerical. Weddings, baptisms, burials, all meticulously recorded. And then, just before the entry for a christening in late September 1974, a single folded page. The indentation of the ink could still be felt beneath my fingers. Forgive me, Father. I saw him fall, but I let him go. Lewis read it over my shoulder and said something about the paper, the watermark, faint but visible, W.R. Balston Lountied. I recognized it immediately. A paper once used by the Oxford Press for hymnals. Expensive. Not the kind a parishioner would buy for letters of confession. I asked Harcourt whether any of the names in the photograph were still alive. He thought for a moment. Spence. Yes. In a home somewhere near Kidlington. Clay teaches at Magdalen. And Miss Davenant, he believed, worked for the Diocesan Schools Board. He spoke the last name almost with relief, as though its utterance lifted a weight. As we left, I noticed a small brass plaque beside the church door. The inscription was half erased by weather, but I could still make out part of a verse. Though I walked through the valley of the shadow of death, the rest had vanished. I thought about the missing words as we walked back toward the canal, how easily faith erodes when no one tends to it. Lewis asked what I made of it all. I told him, perhaps too quickly, that I wasn't sure yet. But the truth was already circling. A note written years after a death, a church that pretended to forget, and a list of names quietly waiting in the margins of a photograph. It felt less like an investigation than an unfinished prayer. The rain began again as we reached the bridge, rippling the surface of the canal. For a moment, I could almost see the reflection of a man falling and someone watching, unmoving, from the bank. It was late afternoon when we returned to the vestry. The light had turned the color of brass, filtering through the rain-streaked windows in thin, trembling threads. I remember standing before the photograph again, the one that hung slightly crooked above the cupboard. The choir at Wells Cathedral, Easter 1974. Faces arranged in neat rows, as though harmony could be captured by posture alone. Lewis had fetched a step-ladder from the sacristy, muttering something about wanting a closer look. He was practical that way, content to check labels and frames while my thoughts wandered the quieter corridors of implication. I stood behind him, noticing how dust gathered along the glass edges like old breath. The inscription beneath, in a precise clerical hand, listed each name and title. But what caught me wasn't the writing. It was the way one of the figures, a boy standing just behind Canon Draycott, seemed to be looking away from the camera. Everyone else gazed dutifully forward, their smiles formal and subdued. But his eyes had turned toward the vicar, mid-expression, as though something had been said just before the shutter clicked. I asked Lewis to read out the names from left to right. He did. Draycott, Spence, Clay, Davenant, and others now anonymous in the passing years. When he reached the end, he added that Simon Clay was the only one still in Oxford proper. A music tutor, apparently. The sort of detail he retrieved from directories with the steadiness of a librarian. I could hear the faint irritation in his tone, the unspoken question of why a photograph should matter. But photographs do matter. They are moments stolen from time's good manners. They tell us not how things were, but how someone wanted them remembered. I'd learned long ago that guilt can hide most easily behind composure, yet it often forgets the eyes. The frame itself was cheap wood, newer than the others in the room. The glass pane held faint fingerprints, perhaps from when Harcourt or a cleaner had adjusted it. Yet something about its position seemed deliberate, too central, too prominent for an item that predated the current vicar's tenure by decades. I asked when it had been hung there. Harcourt, after some hesitation, said it had been on the opposite wall until last year, when damp had threatened the plaster. He looked uncomfortable under the weight of such a trivial question, as though some secret might have seeped through the mortar. I told Lewis to photograph it for the file. He raised his camera, the click echoing softly in the vestry. It sounded indecent, that small act of capturing one photograph preserving another. I found myself glancing again at the young man's face, frozen in that half-turned moment. Clay, if the order of names was to be trusted. I wondered what it was he had heard when the picture was taken. The vicar's cat wandered in, silent and spectral, brushing against my leg. Its fur was cold from outside. I bent absently to stroke it and noticed, beneath the chair by the cupboard, a small scrap of torn paper. It had the faint outline of ruled lines, like those found in a choir ledger. Only 3 words remained legible. He sang badly. I slipped it into my pocket without comment. It might have meant nothing, but then, most beginnings do. Outside, the canal bells from a passing boat drifted through the half-open window. Lewis remarked on the sound, saying it reminded him of childhood holidays. I nodded but kept watching the faces in the frame. Margaret Davenant's expression was the opposite of Clay's calm, composed, faintly sad voice. I tried to imagine her years later, working in some school office, surrounded by the innocent noise of children, carrying the ghost of that long-ago photograph in her head. Before leaving, I asked Harcourt whether any other records from 1974 had been misplaced letters, choir attendance logs, anything routine. He said no, but his answer came too fast. When we stepped back into the nave, I could feel the temperature drop. Churches keep their memories colder than most places. As we locked the door behind us, Lewis asked if I'd found what I was looking for. I told him not yet, though I had, in a way. It wasn't the note, or the drowning, or even the names. It was the angle of a boy's gaze, caught forever looking at a man who would soon be dead. Some photographs do more than preserve a moment. They betray it. It was Lewis who found the coroner's file. He brought it to my flat one evening, wrapped in a plastic folder as though it were contagious. The paper inside had yellowed slightly, the ink bled thin by years of indifferent storage. I remember turning the first page and feeling the faintest smell of mildew, and something else, old rain, perhaps. There is always a scent to forgotten things, like a churchyard after service. Canon Draycott's name was typed neatly across the top. Cause of death: drowning. The report was clinical, unfeeling, untroubled by doubt. A bruise to the temple, sustained prior to submersion, but judged consistent with striking the embankment during the fall. The pathologist had written that line as if the word consistent could sanctify imprecision. I've never trusted that kind of comfort. The file closed the matter neatly. Too neatly. Lewis sat opposite me, glancing at the empty glass on the table. He asked if I'd ever heard of Draycott before this case. I told him I thought I had. A sermon quoted once in a college magazine, something about guilt being the price of remembrance. The phrasing had stayed with me. He smiled faintly. Said I remembered odd things. I told him remembering odd things was my profession. We went to the Bodleian the next morning. The archives smell of dust and reluctant obedience, and I've always felt at home there. The clerk produced a box marked St. Frida Parish, 1970s. Inside were pamphlets, bulletins, typed letters, and near the bottom, a newspaper clipping folded twice. Respected Canon drowns in canal tragedy, Oxford mourns. The article was brief. Draycott had been walking home after evensong. The verger had last seen him near the towpath, carrying a small parcel of music sheets. No one saw him fall. I paused on that word again. It had appeared in the Vestry note, the confession written years later. Forgive me, Father. I saw him fall, but I let him go. A repetition that couldn't be accidental. I traced the word with my thumb as if pressure might draw out meaning. Someone had seen. Someone had stood by. There was mention of a memorial service conducted by a Reverend Lionel Spence. The same name scrawled beneath the choir photograph. Lewis read the line aloud, said he'd check whether Spence was still alive. I told him to do it gently, like the vicar's age, like the buildings they inhabit, outwardly enduring, inwardly crumbling. As we left, I found myself glancing toward the window where the rain made faint patterns on the glass. Oxford does that, places its tragedies beneath soft weather, so that even grief feels rehearsed. I remembered standing by the canal years ago, investigating another drowning. The same still water, the same unhelpful silence. The city keeps its secrets beneath the reflection of its own face. That evening, I returned to the church. Harcourt had gone, but the door was rarely locked. Inside, the light from a single candle wavered across the chancel. The air was damp with the smell of old hymns and wax. I walked to the front and studied the marble inscription to the memory of Canon Edmund Draycott, servant of God and scholar of truth. The word truth struck me as almost ironic. On the altar lay a small stack of music scores, left open as if mid-rehearsal. Abide with me. I sat in one of the pews, listening to the creak of wood beneath my weight, and thought about what it meant to see a man fall and let him go. Not push, not strike, just allow gravity and silence to do their work. It was a kind of murder that required faith in inevitability. As I rose to leave, I noticed a faint sound dripping again, from the roof perhaps, or somewhere near the organ pipes. The droplets fell rhythmically, like a clock with a broken escapement. I counted them without meaning to, and at the 7th drop, something shifted in my mind. The verger's testimony had mentioned music sheets plural, yet the archive photo showed only one hand carrying them, a minor inconsistency, but inconsistency has its own music. Outside, the night had thickened. The canal shimmered faintly in the half-light, patient, almost content. Lewis waited by the car, his breath visible in the cold. He asked whether I believed Draycott had been pushed. I told him no. That would have been too simple. I believed he had been watched. Later, alone, I poured a measure of whiskey and stared at the case file again. The typewritten words blurred slightly as the glass caught the lamplight, consistent with striking the embankment during the fall. The line repeated in my head until the rhythm broke apart. Sometimes, I've found, consistency is only another form of concealment. There are certain sounds that never quite leave a man. The scrape of a chair on stone, the faint discord of an organ pipe struggling to find its note. That morning, as I stood in the nave of St. Frida's Wides once again, the memory of the choir seemed to linger in the air, invisible, but not gone. The church was empty now, its echoes domesticated by dust, yet I could almost hear the faint treble of boyish voices. The past performs best when no one is listening. Lewis waited by the font, his breath forming a thin mist in the chill. He had arranged for us to see Simon Clay, the former chorister, now a tutor at Magdalene. Music, naturally. I was not surprised. Oxford breeds a certain kind of man who mistakes structure for redemption, and Clay, I suspected, had spent a lifetime hiding behind both. Magdalene, that day, was drenched in October, light golden, distant, fragile. We found Clay in a rehearsal room that smelled faintly of varnish and regret. He was seated at the piano, playing something that hovered between Schubert and self-pity. He stopped when he saw us and smiled, though his eyes flickered elsewhere. Lewis introduced us unnecessarily. Clay said he remembered the accident, if that's what we still called it. A sad business, he added, before I'd asked. He spoke with a precision that came from long practice, the tone of a man accustomed to explaining away the past. He had been 16, a gifted chorister, fond of the canon. They'd all been fond of him, he said, a generous man, scholarly, but never distant. His voice dipped slightly then, as if the memory carried an unpleasant harmony. He mentioned Lionel Spence, the verger, who'd been strict about attendance and curfews. There had been an argument once, something to do with music funds, but that was nothing, he insisted. Just parish business. I asked about Margaret Davenant. He paused, fingers resting on the piano lid. Yes, he remembered her older than the others. Her mother ran the parish choir library. A fine soprano. She had been close to Draycott, he said, then quickly corrected himself professionally. The correction came too swiftly, and the silence after it felt rehearsed. While Lewis questioned him about the night of the drowning, my eyes wandered across the music sheets strewn over the stand. Bach's Jesu, Meine Freude lay open, marked with soft pencil notations. A single phrase underlined Trotz dem alten Drachen, despite the old dragon. It meant little then, but I wrote it down. Old phrases have a way of resurrecting themselves later, often with teeth. Clay said he had left the church early that evening after rehearsal. Draycott had stayed behind to lock up. He couldn't remember much else. He had gone home, studied, and slept. The kind of night, he said, one forgets immediately. I asked whether he had attended the memorial. Yes, of course, everyone had. He still remembered the hymn they sang, "Abide with me." His voice softened on the words. The same hymn is underlined in the Vestry's old copy. Coincidence is Oxford's favourite disguise. When we left, the bells were ringing from the chapel tower. Lewis said he liked the sound of them. I said they were always slightly flat on the third note. He looked at me, surprised, and asked how I could tell. I told him that imperfection lingers more vividly than harmony. He didn't reply, but I could sense his unease. It is difficult to work beside a man who listens too carefully. That evening, I visited Margaret Davenant. Her office at the diocesan board was neat in the way guilt often is. She greeted me politely, her voice low and even. She remembered the canon well, spoke of him with the careful warmth of a woman tending an old wound. Her mother had adored him, she said. There had been rumours, of course, Oxford thrives on them, but she refused to comment further. She did, however, produce something unexpected, a letter found among her mother's papers after her death. It was unsigned, the handwriting careful and deliberate. I saw him fall, but I let him go. The same words, the same confession. Only this time, written on notepaper bearing the watermark of a college I knew too well, Magdalene. She asked whether it meant anything. I told her not yet. But even as I said it, I knew the sound of that piano chord, the faint quiver in Clay's voice, the underlined hymn. Somewhere between them, a pattern had already begun to hum, faint as a remembered refrain. It was Lewis who found Lionel Spence, the verger of St. Fridswide's, or what was left of him. Not dead, of course, though something inside him had clearly closed long before our arrival. He lived in a nursing home just beyond Kidlington, a low brick building surrounded by unambitious rose bushes, the sort of place where corridors smell faintly of disinfectant and resignation. We were shown into a room decorated with photographs of people who might have been his family, though none bore a recent resemblance. Spence sat by the window, his back bowed, hands folded on his lap as if still clutching the keys of his old vestry. His eyes were pale, the colour of rainwater. When Lewis addressed him, there was no response at first, only the slow turning of his head, like a man waking from a dream too long to end. He remembered Draycott's name. That, at least, stirred something. He said the canon had been a good man, too clever, perhaps, too trusting. The words came out haltingly, interrupted by the small, wet cough of age. I asked about that last evening, the night of the drowning. His eyes flickered once, then dropped to his hands. He murmured something about the hymn books, said the canon had been reorganizing them, then, almost to himself, added that he shouldn't have looked at the hymn book. Lewis leaned forward, trying to catch the words, but I waved him back. There are moments when silence explains more than any answer. I asked gently what Draycott had seen. Spence's lips moved without sound. I could see the effort cost him something. Then, a single phrase. He knew about the ledger. His breath caught on the word, a dry gasp that dissolved into coughing. When he looked up again, his eyes had drifted elsewhere. The nurse arrived then, cheerful, practical, unaware she was interrupting the slow unspooling of a confession 40 years later. She offered tea. Lewis accepted, out of habit, though neither of us drank it. Spence spoke no more. He sat gazing at the window, where rain had begun to trace fragile paths down the glass. I stood beside him for a moment longer and noticed the small brass cross pinned to his cardigan. Its edge was tarnished, worn smooth where a thumb might have rubbed it over time, an unconscious ritual of worry or absolution. Outside, the nurse told us he rarely spoke to anyone. Some days he mistook her for his sister, other days for his mother. I asked if he ever sang. She smiled faintly and said he sometimes hummed hymns under his breath. Only one, though. Always the same, "Abide with me." Back in the car, Lewis broke the quiet first. He asked what I made of it. The hymn book, the ledger, the cryptic warning. I told him I wasn't sure yet, though the phrase "the hymn book told him so" had begun to circle my thoughts like a persistent fly. There was something literal in it, something material. We had seen the hymn books in the church, some new, some from the old printings of the Oxford University Press, their pages thin as forgiveness. I wondered whether one of them had been altered, inscribed, or hidden. When we reached the station, I sent Lewis to fetch the Vestry's hymnals from storage. There were 23 in all. I went through them slowly, page by page, until my fingers began to gray from the dust. Near the back of one edition, bound in blue cloth, I found a faint pencil mark beside the final verse of "Abide with me." 2 underlined words I still triumph over. Nothing else. But the graphite had been pressed hard enough to indent the paper. Beneath the page, on the next leaf, faint traces of an erased word remained, letters uncertain but suggestive. Forgive. I stared at it for a long time. Then I remembered Spencer's words, "The hymn book told him so." Perhaps it had. Perhaps confession had been hidden in plain sight all these years, tucked between the folds of prayer. Lewis returned, saying he'd checked the parish accounts from that year with a small deficit, nothing scandalous. But a ledger is missing. I didn't reply. Instead, I ran my thumb across the indentation of that erased word, thinking how easily remorse fades under time's hand, leaving only the faintest outline of what it once meant. Later that night, I poured myself a whiskey and listened to the rain against the window. I found myself humming the hymn, though I couldn't remember when I'd last sung anything. I triumph still, if thou abide with me. The melody trembled somewhere between solace and accusation. I stopped before the final line. Some endings, I've learned, are better left incomplete. It was raining again when I went back to St. Frideswide's. It always seemed to rain when that church decided to speak. The canal had swelled to a dark mirror, swallowing the reflections of the trees and the tower alike. Lewis had gone home. I hadn't told him I was coming. Some visits require solitude. The air inside was heavier than usual, as though the walls had grown tired of keeping secrets. Reverend Harcourt was in the vestry, his coat still on, his eyes shadowed with something close to apprehension. He said he hadn't expected me, and I told him the truth, rarely sending a calling card. He smiled thinly at that, then asked if I'd found what I was looking for. I said not yet, though it was a polite lie. I'd found something, the underlined hymn, the erased word, the echo of a man's fear. But understanding and evidence are rarely the same thing. He offered tea. I declined. There was a half-burned letter in the small wastebasket beside the desk. Its edges curled inward like petals on a dying flower. I asked about it, casually. He said it was nothing but parish correspondence, old drafts. His voice trembled on the word old. I picked up the remaining piece before he could protest. The ink had run, but a few words clung stubbornly to the paper. Danger of old secrets being read aloud. The rest was ash. He said he'd meant to destroy it entirely, that it was sentimental nonsense. I told him sentiment is a dangerous excuse for deceit. He looked at me then, properly, and for a moment there was defiance in his eyes. Then, almost gently, he admitted he had found the note weeks before it was sent to the archive. I didn't know what to do with it. He'd prayed about it, he said, and the answer had been silence. I told him silence is an answer only when one already knows the truth. The candle beside us guttered slightly, and in the flicker I saw his hands tremble, not with guilt, but with the exhaustion of a man keeping something at bay. He said he had read the confession more times than he cared to admit, that it had unsettled him, though he couldn't say why. I believed him. The guilty rarely read their own confessions twice. Only the haunts do that. He spoke of Canon Draycott with a reverence that bordered on fear. Said the man had been brilliant, demanding, perhaps too much of both. That he had stirred loyalties not easily understood by those outside the parish. He glanced toward the photograph on the wall as he said it to the choir at Wells. His gaze lingered not on Draycott, but on the two figures behind him. I asked whether he had known either. He shook his head quickly, too quickly. When I left the vestry, the air felt colder, as though the conversation had displaced the warmth. Outside, the rain was steady, soundless against the canal. I stopped beneath the old lich gate and thought of the line he'd muttered about the danger of old secrets being read aloud. The choice of words was interesting. Not discovered, not revealed, read aloud. A phrase belonging to churches, to sermons, to confession. Whatever the secret was, it had been spoken before, somewhere where words were meant to absolve. Back at the station, I went through the file again. Lewis had added a short report on Margaret Davenant. She'd called earlier that afternoon, apparently distressed. I wanted to speak privately. I phoned her at once. Her voice, when it came, was steady but drained of warmth. She said she remembered a visit from Canon Draycott a few days before his death. He had come to return a hymn book her mother had lent him. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, but when she opened it later, a page was missing. The hymn, she thought, had been "Abide with Me." I asked if she still had the book. She hesitated, then said she'd burned it. I thanked her, though I didn't know what. That night, sleep refused me. I poured another measure and stared at the crossword spread across my table. The clue I'd left unfinished days ago was still there. 7 letters. A word for something hidden yet always seen. I tried shadow, mirror, and secret. None fit. Then, almost absently, I wrote confessor. It fit perfectly. As I set down the pen, I heard the echo of Spencer's broken voice in the nursing home. He shouldn't have looked, and then Harcourt's words, danger of old secrets being read aloud. They belonged to the same vocabulary, the same quiet terror of exposure. The rain had stopped by then. The city lay hushed beneath the weight of its own reflections. I sat there a long while, listening to the clock's slow pulse, thinking how every confession, however sincere, contains a contradiction. One tells the truth not to be absolved, but to share the burden of remembering. There are certain places where memory lingers, like damp Folly Bridge was one of them. Even now, I can smell the iron tang of the water, the faint sweetness of algae clinging to the stones. The canal beneath was sluggish, indifferent, carrying the weight of a history it had not asked for. I stood there in the grey of early evening, looking down at the spot where Canon Draycott had fallen. The river gave nothing back but its reflection, and even that trembled. Lewis arrived late, a paper cup in hand, the coffee long cooled by the walk. He said there'd been no new reports, no new witnesses, only a file note about a young man who'd claimed to see the canon lose his footing. I asked for the name. He found it after a pause, as though the paper itself resisted the telling. Simon Clay. I said nothing. There was something inevitable in it, the sort of name that waits patiently for its hour. We walked along the towpath in silence. The moss had grown thick where the embankment curved, soft enough to erase footprints. Lewis pointed out where Draycott had supposedly slipped. The railing was low, the ground uneven, yet not perilous. I crouched, running my fingers over the stone, feeling for the story beneath the story. Clay had said he'd seen the cannon fall, had tried to help, but there had been no mention of a shout, no description of movement, only a vague recollection of a figure leaning too far. The phrasing struck me as neutral, careful, as though memory itself had been edited for civility. A narrow boat drifted past, the hum of its motor low and lazy. The driver raised a hand in greeting. I returned it absently. Lewis asked if I believed Clay. I told him belief was a poor substitute for evidence, but that the two often lived together out of convenience. The truth, I suspected, lay not in what Clay had seen, but in what he had chosen to describe. We crossed to the opposite bank. The bridge looked different from that angle, steeper, darker, its arch swallowing the light. I imagined Draycott walking home that evening, his cassock damp from mist, his thoughts elsewhere. Perhaps he'd paused, looked at the water and seen something that stopped him short. Or someone. The police report had described a bruise on his temple consistent, they'd said, with striking the embankment during the fall. Yet the spot where he was found was too deep, the current too slow to have carried him there unaided. Consistency again, that word they loved so much. Consistency was the coffin lid of curiosity. Lewis was speaking, something about the choir records. Spence had made an entry the night before Draycott's death music books. I asked whether the ledger had turned up. He shook his head. Missing still. It was always the small things that vanished first. A drizzle began to fall, fine as dust. The lamps along the bridge flickered into a weak glow. I watched the water darken, the rain striking it in perfect indifference. There was a sound behind us, the faint scrape of a bicycle chain. A young student rode past, head down, bag slung carelessly. For a moment, the shape of him, hunched and narrow-shouldered, seemed almost like Clay's photograph from the choir trip. Time folds strangely in this city. One face always resembles another. As the cyclist disappeared, I caught the faint echo of a bell from the tower beyond the trees. One note repeated wrong, persistent, unfinished. I thought of the hymn again, "Abide with me," and the phrase underlined twice. I triumph still. Triumph, a word that doesn't belong in death unless spoken by the living. We walked back toward the car. Lewis said he'd arranged to see Clay again, perhaps at his rooms. I told him to leave it for now. He looked puzzled, but obeyed. There was something about Clay's story that wanted patience. Lies, like wounds, reveal themselves in the way they heal. Before leaving, I turned once more to the bridge. The river beneath had gone almost black, a pane of liquid glass. I saw only my own reflection there, a man standing where another had fallen, watching the water for an answer it had no reason to give. And for the first time that night, I thought I heard a whisper of movement below the surface. Not current, not wind, but something quieter. Memory, perhaps, surfacing for a moment before sinking back to where all the old truths sleep. I remember that evening with unusual clarity. The rain had slackened, leaving a fine mist that made Oxford's gas lamps appear as trembling candles in a cathedral. I was alone in my flat, a measure of whiskey poured and left to the side, the crossword splayed before me on the table. It had been there for days, taunting with its unfinished final clue. 7 letters. Something hidden, yet always present. I'd tried shadow, secret, penitent. None satisfied the mind or the spirit. Lewis had gone to check on Clay's availability for another interview. He'd left his coat draped over the back of the chair, the cuffs still damp, and the faint smell of the towpath clinging to it. I stared at the ink across the page. The words in the vestry note, the faint pencil underlining in the hymn book, the erased letter in Spence's ledger, all circling in my thoughts like an unsolved equation. The line from the note kept coming back. I saw him fall, but I let him go. Each repetition brought with it a question not yet asked. Who had watched it? Who had refrained? And why had the confession waited decades before being revealed? My fingers drummed lightly on the table. That gesture, absent-minded but deliberate, reminded me of a minor clue I'd overlooked during the interview's Margaret Davenant's hesitation when I'd mentioned the canon's last visit. She corrected herself too quickly, almost anticipating my thought. The smallest acts often betray the largest truths. I lifted the pencil, circling letters, trying to coax the answer from the grid. Confessor seemed too obvious, yet my intuition leaned toward it. The word suggests one who carries knowledge without relief, who knows what cannot be unlearned. And the pieces fit the hymn underlined twice. Spence's whispered warning, Margaret's unsigned letter among her mother's papers. All elements pointed towards someone bearing silent witness, someone who had preserved memory like a ledger of conscience. I paused to glance out the window. The canal was barely visible, its surface a mirror of faint grey. The bridge where Draycott had fallen loomed in memory. The timing, the witnesses, the absence of disturbance, it all aligned imperfectly. Clay had been present, yet the exact details of his observation were suspiciously vague. Margaret's letter had clarified part of the narrative, but introduced another layer of deliberate concealment, followed by selective confession. Each acted with a purpose that was part morality, part self-preservation. The crossword stared back at me. 7 letters. A word for one who both observes and withholds, one who bears responsibility without relief. I tried to watch, observe, and watch. None fit the rhythm of the grid. Then, almost absent-mindedly, I traced the letter's confessor. It fit perfectly. The word illuminated everything simultaneously. The note in the Vestry book, the erased word in the hymn, Spence's trembling admission, and the subtle duplicity in Margaret's manner. Confessor. Someone had watched, understood, and refrained, carrying the truth quietly for decades. I poured a little whiskey into my mouth and let it settle. The warmth helped, but it could not disguise the ache that came with recognition. Truth, when discovered too late, is both a gift and a burden. I thought again of the photograph. Clay's half-turned gaze, Margaret's mother's house, the missing page from the choir ledger. All fragments converged into the shape of the confession, a confession not delivered, but preserved for the right eyes, at the right moment, when the living were finally ready to bear it. Lewis returned, soft-footed as always. He asked whether I'd found the answer. I told him, and he nodded, uncertain whether I meant the crossword or the case. Perhaps both. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving Oxford streets polished and reflective, as though anticipating revelation. The city itself felt quiet, attentive. I glanced once more at the grid, satisfied that every letter now corresponded to a truth I had glimpsed, yet could not fully articulate. Confessor. The last clue had been solved, yet its resolution carried only more questions about memory, guilt, and the delicate arrangement of observation and omission. By midnight I had left the crossword on the table, pencil beside it. The word remained, its meaning both illuminating and haunted. Outside, the canal lapped faintly against the embankment. Somewhere beneath the surface, the reflection of a man falling lingered, observed, carried silently by those who had seen and chosen to let go. I arrived at St. Fridswide's that afternoon with the light falling low across the stone floors, making the dust motes appear almost deliberate, suspended as if waiting for discovery. The vestry door creaked under my hand, welcoming me into its silence. Harcourt was absent, perhaps at the diocesan board, leaving only the faint smell of candle wax and old paper to greet me. I moved toward the cupboard where the note had first been found, my fingers brushing the edge of the ledger that held it, feeling the indentation where decades of care had pressed its meaning into the pages. I unfolded the note once more. The familiar words were neat, precise, yet trembling in their restraint. Forgive me, Father. I saw him fall, but I let him go. The ink, brown with age, seemed almost to absorb the light, refusing to reveal more than it had intended. I read it twice, slowly, aware that somewhere beyond the quiet air of the vestry, Oxford continued its indifferent rhythm. Lewis arrived quietly, carrying the latest report on Margaret Davenant. She had agreed to meet him and had asked only for discretion. I could imagine her walking the familiar streets, careful to keep the past folded neatly beneath her coat, as if it were an umbrella not yet opened. Lewis spoke of her composure, of the small tremor in her voice when she mentioned her mother. I noted it, but said nothing. Such tremors speak louder than explanations. I placed the note beside the hymn book I had previously examined. The pencil underlining on "Abide with me," faintly erased words, the indentation of "I triumph," still all of it seemed to gather into a delicate lattice of confession. Someone had thought carefully about the placement, about who might eventually see it, about timing. The note was a bridge, fragile yet unbroken, connecting past events to the present moment. I thought again of Clay's testimony. His memory was precise, yet incomplete in ways that suggested more than forgetfulness. His words about leaving the canon alone by the canal, the angle of his observation, the absence of detail, all pointed to what had been left unsaid. Margaret's letter clarified part of the story, but deepened the ambiguity. She had watched silently and waited until the right conditions for confession emerged. A decades-long patience measured in paper and pencil. I returned the note to its folded state and placed it carefully between the ledger pages. Its presence there was deliberate, the margined confession preserved as a quiet warning or perhaps an act of penitence. I wondered whether the canon himself had known, whether he would have understood the meticulous timing of memory and guilt, how some truths demand to be hidden before they can be acknowledged. Outside, the light had shifted, softening the edges of the vestry window. The canal mirrored the sky in a way that suggested reflection, both literal and moral. I thought of the photograph, the faint glance of Clay's face, the posture of Margaret's hands when she held her mother's letter. These were the gestures that held meaning: a tilt of the head, a hesitation in voice, the gentle fold of paper decades old. I recognized the rhythm of human secrecy. It is rarely violent. More often, it is quiet, persistent, and insistent. Lewis suggested we return to the flat and compare notes. I agreed, but lingered a moment longer, running my finger over the ink. Confession is a peculiar thing. It thrives in liminality, neither fully present nor entirely absent. I thought of the way the words seemed almost to breathe, held between pages, waiting. There is a subtle triumph in leaving a message where someone might discover it after the world has moved on. It is a triumph not of revelation, but of endurance. On the walk back, I considered how many people had been complicit in silence. The canon, the verger, Clay, Margaret, each carrying fragments, each performing their part in a quiet choreography of omission. And yet in the note, one voice had finally spoken for all of them, choosing timing over immediacy, confession over accusation. I wondered whether Margaret had intended for it to be read, or whether the discovery was merely a consequence of human curiosity. Back at the flat, I placed the ledger on the table, alongside the letters and hymn pages, and poured myself a measure of whiskey. The note remained folded, its meaning intact, fragile yet undeniable. I could not fully resolve the case because the confession's weight was not mine to lighten. Some truths, I reflected, are meant to exist in the quiet spaces between action and memory, preserved not to condemn, but to endure. And as the evening deepened outside, Oxford itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next observer to notice what had always been there. The rain returned that evening, soft and insistent, tapping against the panes of my flat like a distant, patient Morse code. I sat with the ledger open, the note folded carefully beside it, the hymn book beneath the weight of my palm. The city outside was muted, its streets slick and reflective, the lights blurred by water and memory. I thought of the canal, of Folly Bridge, of the slow descent of Canon Draycott into that dark water, and of the countless small silences that had accompanied him. Lewis arrived shortly, carrying a folder and the faint scent of wet pavement. He placed the papers on the table without comment, I did not ask for a summary. He knew I would want to review the material in my own time, in my own rhythm. There is a particular discipline to reading the evidence alone, to allow it to settle around the edges of thought before attempting any interpretation. I revisited the photograph, the choir frozen in Easter 1974, their faces as formal and as delicate as the carved stone of the church. Clay's half-turned gaze, Margaret's composed eyes, the subtle distance between Draycott and Spence, all details now resonating in a quiet pattern. The note in the Vestry book, the pencil markings in the hymn, the faintly legible word on the ledger page, they coalesced slowly, like the first droplets of rain forming rivulets on stone. Margaret's letter had arrived in my memory that morning, unsigned yet unmistakable. I saw him fall, but I let him go. There was no accusation in it, only the deliberate acknowledgement of observation and omission. That small gesture, confined to ink and paper, was enough to illuminate the network of choices that had shaped the events of 1974. And yet, it explained little. Truth, I've always found, is seldom a comfort. The crossword lay before me, unfinished except for the final answer. Confessor. 7 letters. The word had revealed itself fully only when I had traced its meaning back through the small, overlooked gestures. A trembling hand, a hesitation of voice, a deliberate underlining. Each act was subtle, but when considered in the aggregate, they became undeniable. Someone had carried the weight of memory with precision, allowing consequences to unfold quietly, without interference. Outside, the wind carried the smell of wet stone and fading leaves. The lamps along the street flickered, their glow distorted by rain. The city seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a revelation it knew would not arrive. I thought of Spence, of Clay, of Margaret, each a custodian of secret knowledge, each playing their part with the patience of decades. Confession, preserved and delayed, had become a force in its own right. I poured a measure of whiskey, letting the liquid settle warmth into my hands. I could almost hear the faint echo of the choir, the last phrase of "Abide with me" drifting through memory, underlined twice, erased and rewritten, persistent as regret itself. The river outside the window carried reflections of the city, distorted and fluid, and I imagined the cannon's fall, remembered not as tragedy alone, but as the locus of countless quiet decisions and unspoken observations. Lewis asked whether the case was concluded. I did not answer immediately. Some cases never end. They simply persist in the intervals between action and reflection. The note had spoken. The ledger had revealed its mark. The hymn book had whispered its underlined secret. What remained was the quiet acknowledgement that truth, even when partially revealed, leaves a lingering ache, a sense of something unresolved yet understood. I leaned back, listening to the rain tracing paths down the glass. Oxford seemed to exhale softly around me, aware of its own mysteries. The city had absorbed the years, the confessions, the falls, and had returned them in fragments, reflections in water, in paper, in faint echoes of remembered music. I considered the note, folded and waiting, and thought that some messages are best carried silently, entrusted to the patience of time. The rain continued, steady and even, filling the night with its persistent presence. I sipped my whiskey and let the quiet settle around me. The case, such as it was, had reached a form of stillness, a delicate balance between revelation and restraint. Outside, the canal rippled faintly under the streetlights, and I knew that the city, the notes, the memories, and I would carry this story always, quietly, like a hymn under my breath, waiting for the next observer to notice what had long been present.